On the Run has just come out with a deceivingly similar paint to the OTR Soultip paint. That's the stuff that you get in your 003 Soultips, your 004s, other ones like the 007 mini mops. You get the picture. But now they have this paint, which they are calling the OTR 902 marker paint. And we're going to be doing a full tagging test and a buff test with this marker paint today to be comparing it directly to the Soultip paint to get a feel for the differences between the two. So first thing is first, what is this stuff? Well, OTR has it classified as a high quality super permanent ink, not a paint. But based on the separation that you can see here on screen between the base agent and the pigment, to me it looks a lot like a paint. But the point of this stuff is, because it's supposed to be able to flow through your traditional nibbed mops as well as your chisel tips or bullet tips, we're going to be testing it out in, again, your traditional mops as well as chisel tip markers here to see if that holds true. We're going to be emptying out one of these grog cutters here to use as our chisel tip for the day to make sure it actually does flow through those chisel tip nibs. And not only that, but we are going to be comparing them side by side to the Soultip paint so that you guys can visually see the differences in the formulae of the 902 marker paint versus the good old Soultip paint. And then, because they've dug their own grave and put super permanent on here as well as ink, we are going to be doing a very loose buff test to see how this new marker paint holds up for us outdoor users. And at the end, all of that information will come together for me to be able to tell you guys if this stuff might be worth you picking up and trying out for yourself. I'll tell you all about this marker paint as we get into our surface tagging test here, but first, let's get all these mops filled up. While we get these mops filled up, I want to give a big shout out to today's sponsor, Skillshare. Now, Skillshare has been supporting the channel here, I know, crazy, right? For quite some time now. They actually have a platform that I really like. If you don't know, Skillshare is this massive online learning hub where you can take classes on anything from stock market investing to Photoshop effects to illustration and even some graffiti stuff. Thanks to Skillshare, right now you can go and click the first link in the description to redeem a 1-month free trial of the entire Skillshare platform where you can explore the whole platform, do whatever you want for free for an entire month. Personally, at this point, I've actually racked up quite a few hours on Skillshare. I started with a stock market fundamentals class from Zach Hartley. If you guys don't know, I'm always interested in a lot of stock market stuff. I've also done some Photoshop classes on there as well as a calligraphy class. Those calligraphy classes can be great if you want to improve your graffiti tags specifically. So if any of that sounds interesting to you or helpful, you can click the first link in the description to get your 1-month free trial of, again, the whole Skillshare platform. Heck, you can even sign up, use it free for 30 days and cancel if you really wanted to. But getting that free trial goes a long way towards supporting the channel here, and I would really appreciate it. But we've got our surface all set up here for our tagging test. We have this nice glossy smooth surface that we're going to test it out on, as well as this unfinished surface, and this is what we're going to be using for our buff test. Right now we are going to throw a tag up on this surface just so it has a chance to sort of cling to the surface, settle in, and actually bite the surface a little bit before we try and buff it. With all that being said, I'm going to do 3 things while I tag up some names of those graph heads who have asked for a hit off in our videos here. here on the channel. Number one, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about this marker paint while we test it out using a chisel tip and see if it actually does flow through a chisel tip marker. And secondly, we'll be comparing this in a drip mop. This here is the silver marker paint, and we're going to compare it directly to the Soultip paint in identical mops just to see the differences between the two formulae here. And thirdly, what we're all waiting for, I'm sure, is I will be doing another impromptu episode of Will It Buff, our sort of mini series here where we try and buff Graffiti's most permanent supplies, if you will. So let's get started right away with these chisel tip tags. So starting off, I emptied out that grog cutter completely. Obviously, there's a bit of whatever sort of greenish color was left in there. I tried to outline with the mini grog cutter that had the same color in it what the old green looked like compared to the green that was mixed with this new marker paint. They look really similar on camera, unfortunately, but just the fact that you can see the difference in color, hopefully, tells you that that marker paint is coming through that nib and it's flowing through the chisel tip just fine. In terms of the marker paint in general, I do want to say they have over 20 colors of this right now. They do have a gold and silver. They also have some pastel colors. They have some neon colors. They really do have a pretty comprehensive color selection for it being a paint refill that you just grab and put in whatever you want. So even if you are looking to use this on like canvases with some bullet tip markers, something like that, their color selection is up there, so you can probably find something that you might be looking for. In terms of the pricing, all you really need to know is it comes in these 100ml bottles and it's a little bit more expensive than the Soultip paint. Now, that being said, the Soultip paint also comes in 120ml bottles. So you're getting a little bit more of the Soultip paint for a little bit less. So all around, you would expect it to be a bit of a higher quality paint than say the Soultip paint is. That being said, I was really impressed right away with the opacity of it. It stood up fairly well. Very nice and opaque. The color very vibrant. You can see the addition of the blue to that grog cutter green, even though I tried to empty it out. The silver, very bright. So the actual color formulation looks really nice to me, and it does indicate that it's a high quality paint, in my eyes at least. Notice I am saying paint here. This really is not an ink. You know, it's funny because like even people in this industry use paint and ink interchangeably, which they're not really interchangeable words, but that's fine, But I think that's sort of what's happened here on the labeling. But moving on to the 902 marker paint tags in this nice juicy 007 drip mop here. We've got the silver. We're using the silver there, and for the Soultip paint, we have that nice sort of, it's a couple different Soultip paints mixed together actually. First thing to note, the Soultip paint, the nib I have on that particular 007 is completely destroyed. Hence the empty lines, we're essentially just writing with a plastic compressible tip. There really is no felt on top of that, so it made it extra drippy, extra streaky, but you still get a feel for the formula. And if anything, what I do have to say about that is they're both very drippy, fairly thin paint formulae. I do want to say that the marker paint definitely is a little bit thinner. It should be if they're saying they want it to flow through those nice chisel tips and bullet tips, so you should expect that's a little bit thinner than the Soultip paint, and I think that is the truth. This might sound weird, but the way you can tell it's a little bit thinner is how it dries. The thinner paints tend to not be so sticky when they're in the middle of drying, whereas the thicker ones, you do get that sort of like stickiness while they're drying. And that's very much the case with the Soultip paint, not so much for the new marker paint that we're using here. Even on the unfinished surface where we're using exclusively the marker paint 902, the new stuff, with this silver, you can tell very, very glossy. This is a very glossy paint, I love that. And it looks really fine, it looks nice and finished, and overall really impressed with that. I did try to do a few sort of very drippy tags with the 902 marker paint. You can get the drips. Of course, you can get the drips, especially when it's a bit of a thinner formula. I found it fairly easy to get some nice drips with if that is your bread and butter. But this part is for all those graph heads out there who really want the most permanent juice to be working with. I get it, you work hard, you get your name up there. We've all had the pleasure of driving past a spot that we just got up on and all of a sudden it's just not even there anymore. If that sounds familiar, let me welcome you to another mini episode here of Will It Buff? Since we're talking about it, I actually have exclusive videos on my Patreon page where we test and see if a bunch of different paints and inks will they buff on the unfinished and finished surface just like this. So if that's something that interests you, you can go check that out on the Patreon. It's like $3 a month. Anything I make over there goes towards these reviews. So this has had about an hour and a half now to just sit here and settle into the surface. And the reason we're doing this in the first place was because they bothered to call it an ink. I think they dug their own grave on that one, but that is why I wanted to do a nice buff test here. That being said, a lot of paints and a lot of graffiti writers don't seem to understand that paints in general are very, very hard to make buff proof. They're nice and weatherproof. You know, their pigments do great in weathering, but it's very hard to make any kind of paint that is going to be buff proof and weatherproof. We're just using the standard sort of household graffiti removers here. You know, you've got an actual one that's called a graffiti remover as well as a general remover here. We'll try both. I suspect we'll just need this one. I use these ones because frankly, they take care of everything from the most permanent of the inks to just your normal paints. This seems to do it all. So let's get right to the unfinished surface and see if it buffs. We're just doing the first half of the tag here. We'll try the other half with our other buffing material. You know, dare I say it, you're seeing a little bit of a ghost there. I don't think it would stay if I really wanted to clean this up. But let's move on to the general all-purpose remover. Nothing real revolutionary is happening here. You know, this isn't really going anywhere. So yeah, that's that. So with all the knowledge we've just gained with our tagging tests here and our buff test, let me tell you one final thing as to why you might want to pick up the marker paint instead of the Soultip paint. And the one redeeming thing about it that I think might make it a good choice over the Soultip paint, because it's something you're probably not considering. So let's sit down and do that. Alright, so here is the situation. I'm putting these side by side, and it wasn't until I put them side by side that I actually noticed the size difference and looked at the labels and thought, this says 120 mils, this says 100. And then I looked at the price difference and thought, the smaller one is more expensive. So the question I'm asking all of you guys, and I would love to get your opinion on this as well, is why would anyone bother to buy this? Here is my answer, and here's the one catch that I think might make this a worthwhile paint. For the most part, these are very similar formulae. They both have very vibrant colors. In my experience, the Soultip paint stands up well to weathering over time. I would expect that to be the case for this as well. And if this is slightly cheaper and you get a bit more, why wouldn't you pick it up? Well, it has to do with the thickness of the formula. For me, thin formulae tend to go a long ways. If you're not sure about this and you're thinking, do they? Think about how many tags you can get out of something like a grog metalhead compared to an ink, like a straight up ink, like a buff proof ink or the incredible ink. The answer you'll get in your head is, yeah, those inks just last forever. I feel like I never have to refill my mops that have the ink in them. And that is because those inks are usually very, very thin formulae. So my point here is those thin formulae tend to go a bit further. So even though this looks like a bit of a smaller bottle, and it is, I think it'll go a little bit further. But that's my little argument as to why I think the marker paint might actually be a little bit better. If you're interested in seeing how the Soultip paint holds up to a buff test, I have a video on my Patreon that includes that. If you want to know a little more about either the OTR Soultip 007s or the grog cutters, we have done reviews of both of those here on the channel. Those are what's on screen right now for you to check out if you're interested. If you found the video helpful, don't forget to throw a like on it. That really helps me out. You can check out the Skillshare link for your free trial in the description as well. I hope to see you over in those videos. Until then, peace.